Since Pope Leo XIV uttered those words at the last Mass celebrated in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Catholic world has never been the same. The words were not shouted, nor were they accompanied by theatrical gestures or public declarations that could be easily manipulated by the press. No, it was a whisper, but a whisper so profound that it reverberated through the marble corridors of the Vatican and crossed oceans, reaching the most remote places where small, forgotten communities still celebrate Mass in silence and poverty. The phrase, simple and disarming, was, "It is time to tear off the masks, for where there is pretense, God does not remain." He needed to say no more. There was no applause. There were no explanations. Only the sepulchral silence of that Roman morning when, for the first time in decades, all the cardinals present felt they were not witnessing an ordinary homily, but an irrevocable spiritual summons. This was the beginning of what many, both within and outside the Church, are already calling the invisible earthquake. Not because it toppled walls or destroyed visible institutions, but because it began to dismantle, with a silent and irreversible force, the internal structures, the comfortable routines, the old vices that had turned the Church into an institutional machine, forgetful of its contemplative essence. From the beginning of his pontificate, Pope Leo XIV refused to occupy the luxurious apartments of the Apostolic Palace, choosing instead to remain in the modest residence of Santa Marta. But contrary to what many imagined, this decision was not a mere symbolic gesture of humility. It was, as he himself confided to a small group of Benedictine monks, a spiritual strategy. "I want everyone to realize that the Church does not need palaces. It needs altars. It does not need presidents. It needs shepherds." And that is exactly what began to happen. Without noisy decrees or spectacular administrative reforms, the Pope began to provoke a radical transformation, a return to the essence. Suddenly, palaces began to empty, and chapels began to fill. Lengthy bureaucratic reports gave way to silent gatherings of adoration. Frenzied agendas made room for mandatory spiritual retreats. Noise was gradually replaced by silence, but not everyone perceived, at least initially, the depth and radicality of what was happening. For many within the Roman Curia, it seemed like a stylistic adjustment, a personal preference of a more contemplative pope. Until the reassignments began. Priests previously renowned for their political or media skills were quietly replaced by obscure religious figures. Some from small African dioceses, others from cloistered European monasteries. The choice that caused the most astonishment was that of the new secretary for the seminaries, a Cistercian monk who had spent the last 15 years in absolute silence, living in a cold cell in the Belgian countryside, with no presence on social media and no ambition for ecclesiastical positions. When summoned by the Pope, his only request was this: "I will accept only if I can maintain my daily hour of perpetual adoration." The Pope smiled and replied, "That is exactly why I want you there." This gesture encapsulated the entire spirit of Leo XIV's silent reform. It is no longer about choosing the most competent administrators, the best diplomats, or the most charismatic preachers, but about placing at the center those who live what they preach, those who prefer the altar to the auditorium, adoration to applause, silence to notoriety. Resistance was not long in coming. Some sectors of the Church, accustomed to power games and protocol rituals, began to criticize, albeit discreetly, the new style of the pontificate. "The Pope is unpredictable," some said. "He is dismantling structures that took centuries to consolidate," others murmured. But Leo XIV remained unshaken, as he confided to a close cardinal, "The problem is not the structures that fall, but the hearts that have hardened." In his last private audience with a group of religious superiors, he was even more direct. "I don't want a church that functions well. I want a church that loves well. I don't want managers. I want worshippers." There was no need to explain further. Those who understood left with tears in their eyes. Those who resisted remained bewildered. The impact was so profound that in various dioceses in Latin America, priests began organizing retreats of absolute silence, inspired by the Pope's example. In Africa, entire communities started to revalue Eucharistic adoration, which for decades had been relegated to a secondary role in favor of relentless pastoral activities. And in Europe, monasteries on the verge of closing due to a lack of vocations began quietly to receive new candidates. Leo XIV did not need to issue a single magisterial document to spark this wave of spiritual renewal. His authority stems not from decrees, but from coherence. As he once said, "When the shepherd lives what he preaches, the flock listens even to the silence." And that is exactly what is happening. In recent weeks, a new measure by the Pope caused even more stir: the temporary suspension of live broadcasts of the Masses celebrated by the Pontiff. The decision, though criticized by the more media-driven sectors of the Church, was made with serenity and firmness. In a meeting with those responsible for Vatican communications, Leo XIV said, "The Mass is not a spectacle. It is a sacrifice, and a sacrifice does not need an audience. It needs surrender." This seemingly small gesture had an enormous symbolic impact. It touched the wound of a church that in recent times had begun to confuse visibility with fruitfulness, audience with spiritual efficacy. By refusing to turn the liturgy into a spectacle, the Pope is restoring it to its rightful place, the hidden and silent center of the Church's life. But the gesture that resonated most within the Vatican walls happened recently, when Leo XIV, without any prior announcement, decided to spend an entire day in silent prayer with a community of discalced Carmelite nuns on the outskirts of Rome. He brought no entourage, no journalists, and made no speeches. He simply celebrated the Eucharist, shared a silent meal with the sisters, and at the end of the day left a handwritten letter with a single sentence: "You are the hidden heart of the Church, and a heart beats best when no one sees it." This letter was later copied and sent to hundreds of cloistered monasteries around the world. Many religious men and women who for years had felt discouraged or forgotten reported that upon reading those words, they felt seen and recognized as never before. The spiritual impact was so profound that several contemplative communities began to report a new blossoming of silent vocations, as if the Church were finally remembering that the true engine of its mission lies not in management or activism, but in hidden prayer. What Leo XIV is doing is both radical and serene. He is not destroying the Church, but purifying it. He is not shouting, but whispering. He is not imposing, but witnessing. And this silent and coherent witness is shaking the Church more than any fiery speech or bureaucratic reform. He knows, as few do, that the Church is not transformed by decrees, but by conversion, that the mission is not renewed by documents, but by prayer, that the heart of the world is not healed by words, but by presence. That is why he remains there, steadfast, silent, unshaken, walking with slow but resolute steps toward what he called in one of his rare interviews, the only necessary reform, that of the heart. The impact of these silent and firm actions of Pope Leo XIV quickly transcended the Vatican walls, spreading like a spiritual current through dioceses, parishes, and communities worldwide. An archbishop from Southeast Asia, after receiving a personal handwritten letter from the Pope, confessed to his priests, "It is no longer about being efficient, but about being faithful." This echo was repeated in hundreds of places, where pastors and faithful began to realize that the Church was being called to a profound change, not in structure but in soul. And the message was clear: fewer meetings, more prayer; fewer plans, more discernment; fewer speeches, more silence. This inversion of values, which to the world's eyes seemed like a kind of institutional regression, was in fact a spiritual advance. As the Pope said in one of his meetings with seminarians, we must not move forward or backward, but inward. And those who lack the courage to enter themselves will never have the courage to lead others to God. It was precisely this emphasis on interiority that began to unsettle those who for years had turned ecclesial service into a profession, a routine marked by efficiency and the pursuit of measurable results. Suddenly the criterion was no longer what we do, but who we are, and that is a question few were prepared to answer. In consistories, synods and meetings with cardinals and bishops, Leo XIV began replacing long sessions of speeches and reports with moments of adoration and silence. At the first consistory he convened, he surprised everyone by entering the room, not sitting in the papal chair, but kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament exposed, remaining there in absolute silence for nearly an hour. When he stood, he said only, "We can begin. Whoever has something to say, speak. Whoever does not, remain silent and adore." This gesture disarmed even the most skeptical and placed everyone before a disconcerting truth. The Pope is not reforming structures, he is inviting conversion, and that is far more demanding because it is not about changing what we do, but what we are. This spirit of conversion began to reach religious orders as well, many of which had been marked for years by internal tensions, ideological divisions, and vocational decline. Instead of proposing administrative solutions or vocational campaigns, the Pope sent personal letters to various congregations with a direct exhortation. Do not turn your charisms into survival strategies. Make them a fire that burns, even if no one sees it. In one such letter addressed to a women's congregation, he wrote, "When the external habit is impeccable but the fire has gone out, we walk well-dressed but empty." This kind of direct spiritual language, deeply rooted in the Church's mystical tradition, began to provoke a silent upheaval. In various parts of the world, religious communities started rereading their foundational texts, resuming practices of common life, communal prayer, austerity and simplicity, setting aside apostolic projects that, though well-intentioned, had become mere functional programs disconnected from their spiritual source. But perhaps the most emblematic gesture of what is happening was the Pope's decision to temporarily suspend all new canonizations. The justification, simple and striking, was this: before raising more names to the altars, we need to rediscover the value of interior martyrdom, hidden holiness, anonymous fidelity. This gesture, though perplexing to some, was understood by many as a call to a church less concerned with icons and more attentive to the universal call to holiness lived in the everyday, in hiddenness, in the silent offering of one's life. The phrase that encapsulated this vision was spoken to a group of postulators for canonization causes. We do not need more canonized heroes for the church to be holy. We need more Christians on their knees so that the world may believe. This deeply spiritual vision began to influence priestly formation as well. Leo XIV mandated that all seminaries revise their formation programs, placing spiritual life and the formation of the heart at the center. In a private address to seminary rectors, he was categorical. Do not form orators, form worshippers. Do not form managers, form intercessors. Because if we do not kneel before God every day, one day we will kneel before the world. Based on this vision, he recommended that all seminarians undertake, at least once during their formation, a 40-day retreat of absolute silence. No cell phones, no social media, no contact with the outside world. Only prayer, community life, silence, and adoration. This measure, initially met with resistance in some regions, soon began to be implemented in various countries, producing visible fruits. More mature vocations, more spiritual priests, less concerned with strategies and more focused on the priest's essential mission, to be a man of God, a man of the altar, a man of prayer. This movement also began to affect how the Church handles its spaces and resources. The Pope ordered that empty Vatican apartments be used to house passing missionaries, that excesses in meals be eliminated, and that spending on non-essential travel and events be cut. When a senior official discreetly protested being moved to a simpler office, the Pope replied, "What serves the Church is not the space you occupy, but the spirit you bring." This style began to spread even to the most resistant environments. In religious communities, among bishops, in parishes, and even within the curia, where the logic of efficiency and prestige once prevailed, clear signs of change began to emerge. Chapels that were empty began to be frequented again. Holy hours started being organized spontaneously. The sacrament of confession began to be rediscovered not as an occasional rite, but as a path of ongoing conversion. An Italian cardinal confided after a private meeting with the Pope, "He does not ask us for structural changes. He asks us to bleed with love for Christ." And this phrase perfectly encapsulates the radical yet discreet nature of what is happening. Far from seeking notoriety, Pope Leo XIV is deliberately avoiding it. He refused to participate in public events he does not consider essential to his pastoral mission. He cancelled diplomatic audiences that, though traditional, did not directly contribute to his spiritual vision of the Church's mission. Instead, he dedicated more time to prayer, discernment, and personal accompaniment of pastors and communities. Recently, in a meeting with young religious, when asked what he considers most urgent in the Church, he responded without hesitation, "To recover the fear of losing God. Because when it no longer pains us to drift away from Him, we are lost, even if we have perfect structures." This brief and striking response provoked a reverent silence in the room and later spread like a spark among many religious and faithful, becoming a kind of spiritual watchword for this new phase of the Church. More than preserving institutions or maintaining traditions, it is necessary to recover the living awareness of God's presence and the reverent fear of losing Him. This fear, far from being paralyzing, is, in Leo XIV's vision, the engine of true conversion and true mission. As he said in one of his private meetings, "Only those who fear losing God can proclaim with truth. Only those who live with longing for the eternal can show the world a path that does not end in death." And that is exactly what he is doing, placing the Church not at the center of headlines, but at the center of God's heart. And as he himself likes to say, when the Church kneels, the world realizes that we are not strong, but that He is. This is the epicenter of the silent earthquake that is happening. It is not administrative changes or juridical reforms that are shaking the Church, but the return to the essential, to the altar, to prayer, to silence, to presence. And this, though it does not produce grand headlines or impressive numbers, is producing something far more lasting. A Church that is beginning to breathe again, to pray, to burn. And while this silent spiritual movement spreads, quietly transforming the fabric of the Church, Pope Leo XIV remains steadfast, unshaken, almost invisible to those expecting grand declarations or spectacular reforms. He knows, as few do, that the Church's strength has never been in its administrative structures, but in its capacity to worship, to contemplate, and to love without reserve. That is why he has insisted with vehemence on an aspect that, for many, had become a secondary detail, the urgent need to recover silence as a sacred space. On several occasions, especially in private meetings with bishops and religious superiors, the Pope has been categorical. Noise distances us from God. Haste distances us from ourselves. Only in silence does the Spirit speak. This appeal is not theoretical, but profoundly embodied in his own life. He himself spends long periods in his private chapel, in absolute silence, in adoration, without needing anyone to see him or his prayers to be publicly recognized. And that is exactly what he is teaching, that the church does not need to show itself more, but to withdraw more. It does not need to shout more, but to listen more. This inversion of logic has begun to transform not only the personal spirituality of many pastors and faithful, but also the very dynamic of the church. In various dioceses around the world, spontaneous initiatives of perpetual adoration nights, prolonged silent retreats, and a rediscovery of the value of the sacrament of reconciliation, not as a formality, but as a path of interior purification, have begun to emerge. In religious communities, especially those marked by activism or internal tensions, this new spiritual wave has provoked a true examination of conscience. Some congregations have begun closing houses that had become mere administrative or service centers to resume common life and prayer as the essential core of the religious vocation. At the same time, entire parishes have begun to value again the simplicity of a well-celebrated liturgy, catechesis born from spiritual experience rather than mere technical knowledge, small processions, communal prayers, and moments of recollection and contemplation. In a recent audience with a group of Latin American bishops, the Pope summarized this vision with a phrase that, for many, sounded like a true prophetic call. "I prefer a small church on its knees to a large church that is empty." This phrase, which quickly circulated through the Vatican corridors and episcopal communication networks, was interpreted by some as a sign that the Pope is willing to accept the Church losing social, political, and cultural space if it means regaining spiritual depth. And indeed, that is what he has demonstrated in each of his decisions. He does not seek to preserve the Church's influence in the world, but to ensure it remains faithful to the gospel, even if that costs the prestige or power the institution has historically accumulated. His deliberate choice for a simple, austere, withdrawn life reinforces this witness. He refused the luxuries of the apostolic palace, continues to wear his iron cross, his worn shoes, his simple habits. Moreover, he rejected the idea of turning the Pope into a media figure. He cancelled unnecessary broadcasts, protocol events he does not consider essential, and reduced his public schedule to the bare minimum. When a journalist, in a rare interview, asked if he did not fear that this style might cause the papacy to lose its influence in the world, he responded with serenity, "What concerns me is not the Church's influence, but its fidelity. When we are faithful, God takes care of the rest." This absolute trust in God, more than in human strategies, is what is disconcerting many within and outside the Church. Because Leo XIV is not interested in immediate results, but in deep processes of conversion that cannot be measured in numbers, but in spiritual fruits that only time will reveal. And precisely for this reason, many are beginning to recognize that, though his action is silent, his influence is overwhelming. A cardinal who knows him well recently said, "This Pope does not govern like a manager, but like a man of prayer, and that is why he is shaking the Church more than any other. And this shaking is not violent, not destructive. It is a shaking that purifies, that orders, that puts things back in their proper place. As he himself said in a meditation with priests, 'I did not come to change everything, but to return to the true everything God.'" Thus, his most impactful action is not the documents he signs or the speeches he delivers, but the way he lives. His simple life, his silent coherence, his unwavering fidelity to the essential are beginning to create a new paradigm within the Church. Less human protagonism, more space for God's action. This new paradigm is spreading like a wave, reaching remote dioceses, hidden communities, silent monasteries, families rediscovering prayer, young people enchanted not with the Church as an institution, but with the Church as a mystery, as the living body of Christ. An African bishop, after a meeting with the Pope, confided, "He did not speak much, but his presence said everything. I felt I was in the presence of a man who no longer belongs to himself, but belongs entirely to God. And that is exactly what is happening. Leo XIV is leading the Church to this state of surrender, of total belonging to God, where all other things lose their relative importance and only the essential remains. And this essential, as he himself said in one of his homilies, is not what we do for God, but what we let him do in us. Thus, instead of proposing new structures, new strategies, or new pastoral programs, the Pope is simply inviting everyone to one thing, to bend their knees, to silence their hearts, to adore, because he knows, as few do, that it is only in this sacred space that the Church finds its true strength and its true mission. And in this sense, what is happening is not an administrative reform, but a true spiritual revolution, silent, profound, irreversible. For this reason, many are already beginning to call this time not an era of reforms, but an era of purification. And this purification, though it hurts, though it unsettles, though it brings down many masks and structures, is at the same time renewing the Church from its roots. And so, while the world tries to understand what is happening, those who look with the eyes of faith already perceive this is not just another pontificate, but a time of grace, a time when the Spirit blows with force, shaking what is fragile, toppling what is superficial, and confirming what is eternal. As Pope Leo XIV said at the end of one of the few public masses he celebrated in recent months, "When the temple is purified, the noise falls silent and God speaks again." And indeed, that is what is happening. God has begun to speak again, and the Church has begun to listen, not with words, but with life, with adoration, with surrender. And this is the true earthquake, not the one that destroys, but the one that awakens, not the one that devastates, but the one that purifies, not the one that ends, but the one that begins. Because, as Leo XIV himself said, looking at the crucifix during one of his long nighttime vigils, the Church does not need those who administer it, but those who let themselves be crucified with it. And that is exactly what he is doing. Not administering the Church, but letting himself be crucified with it, so that with it he may also rise again.